In Huntsville, Alabama, in 1847, a child was born who was destined to become an artist and a poet. Her name was Howard Whedon. Yes, that's right. Her name was Howard Whedon. Though often referred to as Mr. Howard Whedon, there was certainly nothing masculine about her. She was a tiny, frail maiden lady who wore high-boned collars and gentle curls across her forehead in the fashion of girlhood. Howard was a frail wisp of a girl, but showed a tremendous talent for art at an early age. As she began to paint, she showed a great gift of seeing beauty in nature and in people. She painted nature, and she painted people. She had a special fondness for black people. She saw them as warm, noble people, almost like her own family. As she painted their portraits, she also composed poetry to describe the people and their characteristics or experiences. To show the closeness she felt for her dark-skinned family, let's look at one of her poems and the painting she might have chosen to illustrate her feelings. It's called Mother and Mammy. Among the ranks of shining saints, disguised in heavenly splendor, two mother faces wait for me, familiar still and tender. One face shines whiter than the dawn. None but my mother's face could shine so bright and be so fair. The other dark one leans from heaven, brooding still to calm me. Black as if even rest had found its image in my mammy. It is very hard to separate the poetry and painting of Howard Whedon. With her brush and pen, her critics declare that she caught the spirit of the antebellum Negro of the finest type, self-respecting and respected, and portrayed this spirit with simplicity and truth. In her work, the Negro is not made beautiful, but the beauty in him is revealed. One of the subjects of Howard Whedon's paintbrush was a shoeshine boy. He was a homeless boy named John Rucker. One day, a man, Joe E. Cooper, was having his shoes shined when he asked John where he lived. Upon finding the boy lived almost any place, he took him home to live. John Rucker had a great talent for music. When Al Fields and his group of minstrels came to Huntsville, that's when John was discovered. He became a musician with a group, and he had a successful career. During the days before the war, minstrels were very popular. They traveled from town to town, entertaining people with their music and comedy. Some were white men who painted their faces black. Others were black men. The minstrels sang and played banjos and other instruments. Folk music and folk tales were loved by the people of Alabama. Some dated back to Scotland and England, such as Barbara Allen and Froggy Went A-Courtin'. Square dances and round dances and old-time fiddler tunes were favorites, such as Rosin the Bow, Sally Gooden, Rabbit in the Pea Patch, Leather Breeches, Sugar in the Gourd, and Root Hog or Die. Religious music also played an important part in the lives of the people. Singing schools were held and people learned to sing shaped notes. These songs were called sacred harp hymns. They were old religious songs which had come from England and had been handed down from father to son. In Winston County, on the courthouse lawn, there is a marker that honors some of the early sacred harp musicians. Let's look at a sacred harp book. And then let's hear some of the sacred harp singers who live in Alabama today and who are trying hard to preserve this antique musical art. Some people preferred classical music played on the violin, spinet, harp, or piano. Music associations and opera associations sprang up in some cities, and concert halls and opera houses were built. People from Alabama even became composers and performers. As the art and music reflect the times, so does the manner of dress. As we look back on plantation days in Alabama, we can find several types of clothing. There was the simple clothing designed for rough wear by slaves and the poorer farming class. These were often made from the cotton that grew in the fields around them. The cotton would have to be corded, spun into thread, and woven into cloth. Perhaps then it might be dyed with some of the natural plant dyes from plants growing nearby, and then cut and sewn into garments. The richer people probably had skilled slaves who could spin and weave and sew, but they could also afford to order fancier clothes from other places. Their clothes might well have been brought up the rivers on boats from the port of Mobile, or perhaps they came overland with the new roads and railroads that were being built. The clothes and the architecture definitely reflected the lifestyle of the people who owned them. In Alabama, as in other states, that lifestyle was also requiring mobility. As the state grew, the need for better methods of transportation grew, or perhaps as better methods of transportation were developed, the state grew. The first railroad in the state was only 2 miles long. It was built in 1830, and it spanned the distance between Tuscumbia and Sheffield. Then the counties of Colbert, Lawrence, and Morgan counties were connected by railroads. Part of the purpose of building this railroad was to connect the two parts of the Tennessee River, which was divided by Muscle Shoals. This was the first railroad west of the Allegheny Mountains. Now, this may not seem like much of a start, but by 1860, railroads connected all important towns in Alabama. As the population increased, more and better roads were also required. The early roads were often rough and still full of stumps of trees in some places. That's why the stagecoaches and wagons had high carriages. Some roads were even plank roads. Bridges and ferries across streams and rivers also improved transportation. It might be interesting to note that many of today's highways and railroads still follow the old Indian trails. And as we mentioned, cotton was king, but only if sold. So it had to be transported to market. Alabama's valuable waterways provided access for many. Rafts and several varieties of river transportation were already well known and well utilized by the people of Alabama. Even before statehood, in 1818, the first steamboat was built in our state. It was named Alabama. By 1821, river transportation had speeded up considerably. It took only 10 days for a steamboat to travel from Mobile to Montgomery, whereas it once took keelboats 4 to 6 weeks to make the same trip upstream. The steamboats must have been beautiful with their big side paddles, or their big back paddles for that matter. They were sometimes decorated to look like big floating palaces. People would flock to the riverbanks just to see the steamboat pass, or dock and unload and load. Many of the fancy steamboats had string bands and dances on board. Some of the passengers lived a life of luxury on board, but all was not carefree and happy. Steamboats sometimes exploded and burned, or they sunk. There were many steamboat disasters in those plantation days. One of the worst river tragedies was the destruction of the Eliza Battle. It is said that in this terrible river disaster, 40 people died.
Away from Mississippi's Vale with my old head there for a sail, I crossed upon a cotton bale to Rose of Alabama. Oh, brown Rosie, the Rose of Alabama, a sweet tobacco posy is the road of Alabama. A sweet tobacco posy is the road of Alabama. The river road, the cricket sang, the lightning bolts, he flashed his wings, and like a rope my arms I fling round rows of Alabama. A sweet tobacco posy is the rose of Alabama. A sweet tobacco posy